there's some people that say, well, I'm looking for a perfect church. Then you'll never find it. Because if you joined it, if you found the perfect church and you joined it, it would be imperfect. You'll never find a perfect church. I've traveled all over the world and I've seen hundreds of different types of churches, and I've never seen a perfect one yet. And this side of glory, there never will be. Jesus had a little band of men with him, 12 of them. It was imperfect. Judas betrayed him. Peter denied him. When the chips were down at the cross, the rest of them forsook him. There is no such thing as a perfect body on earth. Get into the church and get to work for Christ.
Start over. Hi, everyone. Okay, so I want to tell you about one of the first times I became disillusioned with the church. So I didn't grow up in the church. I came to faith in college, and so I didn't have any church baggage. I didn't hear all the bad things or grow up with the weird felt boards or any of that stuff. I had to learn. My husband has had to teach me, in retrospect, the weird stuff that he did as a kid. So, but when I was in college, we went to this church that had awesome worship. Now, it was the 90s, early 2000s, so the worship now would feel really lame, but it was really cool back then. And every Sunday night they would do this big worship night, and it was a college town, so all the college students would come, and it was super cool. And the pastor would give a message, and he was seemed like a really genuine, great guy. And I basically did that for 3 full years of college. And then my 4th year of college, a woman came forward and said that pastor had sexually harassed her. And then shortly after she stepped forward, 5 other women came forward and said that they had the same exact experience, and he had groomed them. He had had multiple affairs with women in the church, and it was just shocking. It sent ripple waves of shock throughout the whole community because nobody really saw it coming. And it was the first time where I was like, how could someone look one way and be something totally different? Like, how could that happen? And that is so... it's disillusioning, it's confusing, it makes you angry when you experience something like that. And I wish I could tell you that that's both my first and only scandal in the church that I've ever dealt with, but it's not. It's not. And unfortunately, the church has been scandal-ridden throughout its entire history, but Jesus has something to say about that. See, Jesus has a word for when we look one way on the outside, but we're something else on the inside, and he uses the word hypocrite. Hypocrite. And he has something to say about what it is when hypocrisy enters the church. And the word hypocrite it's a Greek word for a Greek actor in a play who's wearing a mask, right? And so Jesus is one of the first recorded accounts that we have of making that a metaphorical word, of saying it's not just someone who is actually like an actor in a play, but it's someone whose outside doesn't match their inside, who is playing a role, who is deceiving those around them. And so Jesus, he uses the word hypocrite 17 times in the Gospel of Matthew. And one of the most poignant places where he uses it is in Matthew 23, where he confronts the religious leaders of his time. And it starts like this. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others." And so it starts here by Jesus saying these guys, they sit in Moses' seat. So what that means is they have a seat of authority. They're the official interpreters of the Torah, right? And so he says, you should listen to what they say. You should do what they say. But he says, do not do what they do. And in fact, he's emphasizing so much. He says, at no time, at no point should you do what they do. Right? Jesus is the master of hyperbole, as we're going to see today. Like, he likes to make things really big to make his point really clear. So never, ever, ever do what these religious leaders do. Why? what do? Well, first, they tie up heavy burdens and they put them on people. And what he's talking about is not just the Torah, but what was called the oral tradition that the religious leaders put around the Torah. And sometimes they described it like a fence that they put around the law. So that way there were all these extra rules on top of the law to make sure that you never even got close to breaking the law. Like, we're going to put a big barrier around. He says, so they put all these burdens on people, but they won't even lift a finger to help. And Jesus is giving, again, giant heavy burdens, tiny little finger, won't even do the smallest amount of effort to help other people. And then he says, they love to be seen. They love to do everything for show. And he talks about their phylacteries and their tassels. And you might be wondering, what is that? What is he talking about? So the phylactery was this little leather box, basically, that they would wear on their forehead, sometimes on their arm or their hand. And it comes from the Shema, where it says, tie these things on your forehead, put them on your hand. They took that very literally. And so these little boxes on their forehead, and you sometimes see people, people who are Jewish still wear this, and so they would wear this, but he says they make them very, very large, like almost to the point of being ridiculous, like where you couldn't see it. Imagine someone walking around with a giant box in front of their forehead to show you, no, I really know the scriptures, I'm being really serious. And then he talks about their tassels, and these tassels, Numbers, the book of Numbers talks about them, and it says this: when you see the tassels, so they were supposed to tie 4 tassels, they were white and blue to each corner of their robe. And he said, when you see the tassels, you will remember and obey all the commands of the Lord instead of following your own desires and defiling yourselves as you are prone to do. And so both the phylactery and the tassels, they were meant to be like, how sometimes you can tie a string around your wrist to remind yourself to do something, right? Or you write a note on your hand. They were supposed to be a reminder for you. They're supposed to be a personal reminder to stay the way of God. But instead, he says they've taken these personal reminders, and instead they've made them a sign of status, of look how important I am, and I'm so much holier than you are. And then he says, not only that, but they love the most important seats. And so they'd want the seat right up in front of whoever was speaking at the synagogue or the banquet, because that showed I'm also important. Or they walk through the marketplaces and they want to be called rabbi. And that wasn't just about respect, it was they wanted the official term so that everyone was deferring to them. So he says, don't be like that. Don't ever, at no point should you be like that. Do what they say because they're teaching you the way of God, but do not ever do what they do. And then he goes on, after warning his disciples in the crowd, he goes on and he confronts the leaders, and he calls them blind guides, and he says, you're shutting the door to heaven straight in people's faces. You're using the law for your own advantage. And then he says this: woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. And he tells them it's not enough to look good on the outside. You have to start with the inside. And the word he uses there, woe, is a word of lament and condemnation at the same time, of sorrow, but also of judgment. And so Jesus, he is not indifferent to hypocrisy. It's not okay with him for one leader to look one way on the outside, but to be something different on the inside. They need to match. But unfortunately, this type of hypocrisy, this type of corruption has plagued the church since its very beginning. It's been there since the very beginning. And last week, we covered the conversion of Constantine, and we talked about how Constantine, it was this turning point in the church where before they had been persecuted and they didn't really have any power. Their only power was to rely on the power of the resurrection. And then the emperor is now on their side, and now they have power. And it ushered in both good and bad, a mixed bag of good and bad. The good of all the charity that we know started in the church, but also the bad of where we started to see paganism, politics, power, and with that, compromise, where the church slowly started to compromise their standards so that they would stay in power. And eventually, compromise leads to corruption. And Bruce Shelley says it well. He says, whatever Constantine's motives for adopting the Christian faith, The result was a minimal level of Christian commitment among the general population. The stalwart believers whom Diocletian killed were replaced by a mixed multitude of half-converted pagans, Christians in name only. Once Christians had laid down their lives for the truth, now they plotted against each other to secure the prizes of the church. Gregory of Nazianzus, 4th century bishop, complained, "The chief seat is gained by evil doing, not by virtue. And the highest positions belong not to the worthy, but to the more powerful." And so, like all history, there's good and bad. There's ups and downs. It's a mixed bag. And today we're going to cover 1,000 years of history. So we're going to paint with a really broad brush. Okay. So those of you who might be church historians or experts, be gracious here. Okay. Because we can't go into every detail. And there were some great leaders over these 1,000 years. And there were some really awful leaders during these 1,000 years. But we see a trend in leadership, a trend of corruption that enters the church. And the three main corruptors that enter the church are greed, immorality, and status. Greed, immorality, and status. So greed, following the fall of the Roman Empire, land became the primary form of wealth. We entered into a feudal system, and so if you had land, you were kind of in control of this portion of land, and the church had a lot of it. The church had a lot of land, and the church held a lot of society together because there was a political and power vacuum there. So we can be thankful for that, but the church started to wield that power and amass wealth and accumulate for themselves. And while the church, like we said last week, has always been charitable, there's always been a strain of charity throughout all of church history. At this point, the church also starts to see that this wealth is for them. And leaders start to see that, oh, I can take a position and it's for my benefit, and I can start to become wealthy personally. So we start to see greed enter into the church. Bishops start leading these luxurious lifestyles and living in, opulent mansions and for the time. And then along with that comes immorality. And now there was indulgence around food and drink, but primarily sexual immorality enters the church at a very high level. And someone once said, like, a lot of these bishoprics, they started to look more like brothels than churches, which is like, whew, that we hear that and you think that's not good. But what started happening is people took these positions of power and they started to use it for their own advantage. And so we had bishops sleeping with multiple women, having multiple children. Then they're fighting over who has the heir for the position that they want to be in. Their positions were suddenly handed down to family members rather than the most worthy. That's what that person is lamenting about. That suddenly it's not for the person who's most worthy or most caring. It's for who's most powerful, and they're using it for evil. And Jerome, who was a scholar at the end of the 4th, early 5th century, we have this letter that he wrote to a woman, this woman who devoted herself. She decided to devote herself to prayer and contemplation, and he's warning her. And he says this, he goes, "There are other men who only seek the office of presbyter and deacon that they may be able to visit women freely. These fellows think of nothing but dress. They must be nicely scented, and their shoes must fit without a crease. Their hair is curled and still shows traces of the tongs. Their fingers glisten with rings, and if there is wet on the road, they walk across on tiptoe so as not to splash their feet. When you see these gentry, think of them rather as potential bridegrooms than as clergymen." And what he means is they're coming to prey on women. That's what they were doing. We just saw that over and over and over again. Because these weren't people who were committed to the way of Jesus. They were committed to furthering their own agenda and their own political power. And then on top of that, we add status. And so these positions, like I said, these positions of leadership became politically powerful positions. They became associated with the nobility, essentially. And so to be a priest, to be a bishop, that put you in the higher echelons of society. And so people started to fight over these positions. One, they fought over who was going to inherit it. So if a bishop had multiple children with multiple women, they were trying to figure out who was the legitimate heir. And then there was political maneuvering. We even have accounts of people trying to assassinate other people to get these positions. I mean, crazy stuff, like trying to poison them. And then on top of that, we had the practice of simony. And some of you might be familiar with the book of Acts, and there's a character in there called Simon who tries to buy the Holy Spirit, right? That's where that came from, of trying to buy your way into the church. And so simony was people started to pay for these positions. And so bishops primarily weren't there to oversee the flock, which was what bishop meant, the care of the flock. Instead, they became people who could wheel and deal and figure out, like, who's going to give me the best price for this parish and who's going to give me the best price for that. And so it just got more and more corrupt. And I want to share with you some of the worst popes over this time, because there are lots of popes. If you want to read how bad it got, read about the 900s and the papacy in the 900s. But I want to point out a few of them for you just to give you a sense of how corrupt it got. So there's Pope Stephen VI, and he exhumed the body of his predecessor. So the guy is dead, took him out of his grave, tried him for heresy, and then basically defiled the body, allowed people to burn him, and then threw him in the river, right? That's the Pope. That's the guy who's in charge of the church. Pope John the 12th, he gave land to his mistress. He murdered several people, and then he was killed by a man who caught him in bed with another man's wife. So that's the Pope. Pope Urban the 6th, heard that there was a plot to depose him, and so he had 6 cardinals arrested, tortured, and then ultimately executed so he could stay in power. And then Pope Benedict the 9th, he held the papacy 3 different times, and at one point he resigned it to sell it to someone else, and the highest bidder, and then came back to be the Pope. So, this just gives you a taste of how bad things got. And that's at the papacy. Bishops were often worse because they weren't quite as high profile, so it got really bad. It got really bad for a season there. Sometimes when we talk about how corrupt the church is now, you're like, well, we're not poisoning each other, right? We're not hiring assassins to take out other pastors. So, let's put it into perspective. But back then, it wasn't, everything was one, right? So to be in the church was to be in politics, was to be in power. And so it was all combined. And it got more and more corrupt. And again, Justo Gonzalez says it well. He says, the narrow gate of which Jesus had spoken had become so wide that countless multitudes were hurrying past it, some seemingly after privilege and position without caring to delve too deeply into the meaning of Christian baptism and life under the cross. Bishops competed with each other after prestigious positions. The rich and powerful seemed to dominate the life of the church. And so just like the religious leaders of Jesus' time, these leaders in the church eventually lost sight of what the whole point of leadership was. Because the point of leadership was to lead people into the way of God, to help people to live their life better. But instead, they started to see leadership as something that benefits me, that furthers my own agenda, that furthers my own privilege. So we start to see hypocrisy, right? I look like I'm a man of God, but inside I'm different. That's what we see throughout the church. But here's the thing. Jesus didn't just warn us about hypocrisy. He told us how to deal with it. He told us what to do about it. And he does that earlier in the Gospel of Matthew in what's known as the Sermon on the Mount. I always call it Jesus' greatest hits, because there's a reason why, he would have preached this sermon lots of places. We see it in Luke. We see it in Matthew. These are the things that he was known for teaching. And he goes through a whole series of warning for you personally, for us personally, to say, watch out for hypocrisy in yourself. Don't do your deeds in front of others in order to be rewarded. Be aware of how you are trying to earn approval by others. And then he says, and be careful how you judge other people, because the measure that you judge them, that's the measure that you'll be judged. And then he gives us this great image. And he says this, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, while all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And like I said, Jesus is the master of hyperbole. So he's giving a really funny word picture. And sometimes we read the Bible and we think it's so serious and we have to be very holy, but Jesus is very funny, right? And this is a very funny picture because he's saying a speck is like a speck of sawdust, right? A little tiny speck of sawdust. A plank, what he's talking about is a wood, it's a weight-bearing beam that they would use to build a building, right? So he's giving this image of you're looking at someone with a little tiny speck in their eye, a speck of sawdust. You have a weight-bearing beam sticking out of your own eye. You couldn't even get near someone with that, right? You couldn't even get close to them. He says, why are you trying to address this if you don't address you first? He doesn't say, never address the speck in your brother's eye. Never deal with what other people are doing. He says, you can't see them clearly until you deal with it yourself. And that's the key to dealing with hypocrisy, is until you root out hypocrisy in your own life, until you judge yourself in your own hypocrisy, you have no business judging someone else's. And that, he's talking about the community of faith. He says your brother and sister. He's not talking about people outside the community of faith. He's talking about inside. So he says until you measure up to the standard that you're holding someone else, you can't possibly hold them to that standard. That's not how it works. And this is how correction has always worked in the church. And it's so good. God is so good that there are people throughout history who have first dealt with their own behavior and their own standard and their own way of following God before they've dealt with anyone else. When they see corruption in the church, correction comes by a group of people choosing to follow the way of Jesus on their own with integrity. And Andy Stanley, he says, every generation of believers must be prepared to explain their decision to follow Jesus in their generation, to their generation, out of concern for their generation. And every generation has experienced corruption in the church. Every generation. Go to the book of Acts, right when the church starts and you see it. You read Ananias and Sapphira and you're like, it's right there. It's always been there. We're not surprised by corruption because we're not surprised by sin. Sin is real in the church and outside the church. But every generation has had a wave of correction, has had a stream of correction rise up from within to deal with the log in their own eye first before they start judging other people. And the way this has primarily happened in history is what's known as the monastic movement. So when we're talking about monastic, we're talking about monks, we're talking about nuns, and especially in this 1,000 years, remember, there was only one church. There wasn't, that's hard for us to imagine, but there was only one. There was one church. So wherever you lived, that's it. There was one church and everybody had to belong to it. It was illegal not to belong to the church, right? They made Christianity the religion of the state. And so if you were not a Christian, and if the church thought you were working against them in any way, they'd declare you a heretic, and that was terrible. Like you could get tortured, killed, imprisoned, right? There was no options. You couldn't go to the church down the road. There was one church. And so when there were a group of people who would be disillusioned with the church, what they would do is they would create these monastic societies where they would withdraw from society. They would seclude, they would separate in order to build a community that was devoted to the way of God. That's the monastic movement. And it has a long, long history. I'm just going to give some highlights of it. Again, it spans thousands of years, but it starts with the hermits. And the hermits, they moved out into the desert. Sometimes you hear the desert fathers and mothers. So they moved out, and they were all about solitude, right? So you went, and some of them lived in a cave. One of them lived on top of a pole. They were really eccentric. They got real weird, and it was a lot about deprivation. You're supposed to deny all of your sensual temptation. So a lot of them would only eat one meal a week and try to pray for hours. They'd have lots of weird visions, mainly because they were probably starving. It got really strange. There's some great stuff from the desert fathers and mothers, but there's a lot of weird stuff too, right? That's how it started. But then came along Pachomius, and Pachomius said, well, he was first drawn to that, but he's like, you can't learn humility and love and kindness and all of these things that Jesus tells us to do alone. That has to be done in community. So he created the first intentional communal life where they came together and they had a very rigid diet. They had to get rid of all their stuff. They prayed at 2 a.m. They had very fixed hours, and it was really extreme. And that happened, and then again the monastic movement kind of waned, and then Benedict came along, and some of you are familiar with Benedictine spirituality. He kind of created the model for monastic communities, and there's a lot of communities that still use the Benedictine rule of life. And so he created another community, and his big thing was about stability, because there were lots of people looking kind of like what happens now. They wanted a monastic community, but they joined one and they'd be like, oh, these guys aren't perfect, so I'm going to go join this one, and these guys aren't perfect, and they just kept jumping around. And his big thing was there is no perfect monastic community. So when you join, you stay, and then you commit to work through it. So he created a rule of life. There was still discipline, but it wasn't quite as strict. They could have a comfortable bed, a warm place to sleep. They could, dress warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And he expanded their diet. Things like they didn't have to pray at 2 a.m. They still prayed at night before they went to bed, but they didn't have to get up in the middle of the day, the middle of the night in order to pray. And then that eventually waned, right? Benedictine spirituality happened. And then the church got pretty corrupt right around the 900s, and we had the Council of Reims. And this is when a bunch of church leaders came together, and they recorded their own state of affairs, like what they thought. And this is what they said. Every man does what pleases him, despising the laws of God and man and the ordinances of the church. The powerful oppress the weak. The land is full of violence against the poor. This is really important. They said, God's flock perishes through our charge. Like they were taking responsibility. The reason why this is happening is because of our lack of leadership. It has come about by our negligence, our ignorance, that of our own brethren, the monks and the priests. And so right after this, we see a reformer show up again. His name is Otto the Reformer, and he creates what's called the Cluny movement. He was the abbot of Cluny, and he once again revived Benedictine spirituality and brought revival to the church to say we must have reform. Like this is not good enough. And so we have these waves over and over. There's waves in the east and waves in the west, and they were our first missionaries. When the Roman Empire fell apart, we had all these pagan tribes coming in from Europe. It was monks and monastic communities that went out and shared the gospel. So the reason why we even have most of Europe being Christian at any point is because of monastic communities. And they made great contributions to the world. If you like going to pubs, you can thank monastic communities. Like they didn't just make beer, but they invited people in and they created community around it. If you like gardening, you can thank the monastic communities. They would go into areas and create economic prosperity because they would create gardening and they would create ways that people could eat. If you like libraries and books, you can thank the monastic communities. They were devoted to recording not just Christian scriptures, but ancient literature and making copies of that. They would handwrite all sorts of manuscripts because they were important. If you like art, you can thank the monastic community. They were, especially during some of the darkest seasons of humanity, that was a bastion of light. The monastic communities did some really great things. And they decided together, this group of people would decide, you know what? Just because there's a whole bunch of people not doing what they say they should, doing something different, they're not practicing what they preach, doesn't mean that we shouldn't practice that we should do what Jesus tells us to do. And so when they saw the corruption, when they saw the greed and the immorality, and they saw the status seeking, they would withdraw. And what you see consistently throughout all of these monastic movements is a vow. They would take a three-part vow. It would be a vow of poverty, of chastity, and obedience. Poverty, chastity, obedience. And so I know some of you are like, oh, I don't know if I could have done that. It's tough because they were really serious. Again, they didn't have an option to go down the road. So they were devoted to the way of Jesus. And so first, when it came to poverty, to join a monastic community, you had to divest yourself of all your worldly possessions. You had to give it away, sell it. And when you joined, very few monks had anything that they would consider a personal possession at all. Everything was shared, right? And they would wear very simple robes. They would eat very simple meals. Most of them were vegetarians. They ate what they grew. And the whole purpose was that worldly goods would distract you. They would distract you from the way of Jesus. And our primary thing is to care for the poor. And so they would use all of their resources to take care of those around them. And one of the most dramatic instances of this is Francis of Assisi. And if you really want a great, inspirational person in church history, Francis of Assisi, St. Francis, it's a great story. He's an awesome guy. But he grew up as a wealthy cloth merchant, the son of a wealthy cloth merchant. And so he had this very indulgent lifestyle. And he had this encounter with Jesus at some point. And so he came back, and it's a longer story than this. I'm paraphrasing, but he came back and he started giving away the proceeds of all of his sales, right? And his dad, who was not a very nice guy, was not happy and chased him down, brought him to court, and wanted him to make retribution for what he'd given away and to give up his inheritance. And so Francis of Assisi, what he did is he stripped naked in front of his father and said, I am now married to Lady Poverty. Yeah, you own anything that was mine that's worldly is yours. And then he went off and got a robe and created the Franciscan movement, right? But he was devoted to saying it's not about accumulating wealth here. It's about accumulating wealth in heaven. And so we've got awesome stories like that throughout the monastic community. Chastity. So the vow of chastity was often about, restraining from indulgence, but particularly around sexual indulgence. So they took a vow of celibacy to join a monastic community. It got pretty extreme, right? And so, because they saw the debauchery in the church and they thought, well, I can't stop them, but I can stop me, right? And so they created a community where that just wasn't possible because, again, to forsake these types of relationships would be to be able to be completely devoted to God. And then obedience. So on top of that, so Get rid of all the temptations of the world. Get rid of your possessions. Get rid of, romantic and intimate relationship. And now you are completely devoted. You are able to focus on God. And they had a strict adherence to the way of Christ, meaning like what Jesus said, we do, not just metaphorically, we do that. So, we forgive our enemies and we love those who persecute us and we give to the poor and we pray for those around us, both those who know Jesus and those who do not. And so they form around a whole rhythm of prayer where they would get up, in the morning and they would pray, and then they would pray in the midday, and they'd pray at their meal, and they'd pray at dinner, and they'd light candles in order to be a light in the dark. That's part of what they did to pray for people. And all of this, the obedience was all again around primarily being someone who is compassionate and gives to the poor, gives to those around them. And again, Otto the Reformer, another, I mentioned him earlier, just another great story. He was someone who was so devoted to this, so committed to the way of Jesus that wherever he went, wherever he traveled, he always had something to give to those in need. And he would ask those traveling with him, have you brought something to give to those in need? And he would meet people, and he could tell that they were down in hard times, but they didn't have they didn't want to say it. And so he would ask them to sing him a song. And then when they sang him a song, he would pay them an exorbitant amount. Or he would go up to these fruit vendors, who were selling like their measly fruit that they had grown. And he would demand that they double their price and then pay them double that. And then there's a great story where he was coming into town and a thief tried to mug him to take his water jug. And the crowd stopped the thief, but Otto turned and gave him money as well because he said clearly he's in need. And when the governor of the town found out who it was, he arrested the man, the thief, and he was going to cut off his hand because that's what you did back then. And Otto came and pleaded his case and said, no, don't do that. Like, this man is clearly in need. Like, that's not how we should treat one another. And so we see this over and over again, this monastic movement rising up to bring correction to the corruption that they see in the church. But the truth is the monastic movement wasn't perfect, right? I don't want you to sit back and be like, maybe what we need is a new monastic movement. We should all go and get rid of our stuff, and we'll get rid of all of our intimate relationships, and we'll just focus on God. Like, we'll go live in monasteries and grow our own things. Like, they went through corruption just as much as the church, right? Like, they would start to accumulate land and wealth, and the abbot would become a power position, and he had ultimate control, and then they'd have to reform as well. And the church would have to step in and offer correction to the corrupt monastic movement. It just kind of went back and forth as to which one was more corrupt and which one offered the correction. So, like, let's not, demonize the church and say the monks were great. It just is this rhythm. There's corruption, there's correction. There's corruption, there's correction. But the thing that they did do, sometimes they were incredibly successful at reforming the church. Sometimes they were this fringe movement that just got mocked and persecuted or ignored. But they were committed, the two tools they were always committed to using to try to bring about correction, always, it was persuasion and example. Persuasion and example, that we are going to deal with the log in our own eye, that if we want people to live the way of Jesus, it starts with us. Not them, us. And when we do that, we believe that example will be so persuasive that the church will eventually change. And we see that. I mean, part of the reason why we have celibacy in the priesthood now in the Catholic Church was because of the celibacy movement in the monastic movement. Because it wasn't because they thought having sex was bad. It's because it was so rampant that they were like, we have to deal with this. Like, we can't have priests using their position as womenizers. Like, that can't happen. And so they brought about reform over and over again. And while the state of the church is very different today, right? Like, you can go to, if you don't like it here, there's 4 churches within walking distance from here. Like, you can go wherever you want, right? You can choose to be whatever religion you want. It's not illegal to be a Christian any longer. There's not just one church. There's not just one person in power, right? We don't see the same level of corruption that we saw back then because it's not associated with nobility and political power in the same way. So the state of the church is different, but the reality is we have a lot to learn from the monastic movement, the correction that the monastic movement offered the church in order to offer the correction that the church needs today. Because let's be clear, the church needs correction. I mean, that's part of what we've been talking about, both then and now. And the state of the American church is not good. It's not good. We talked about this in week 1, how the general opinion of the church is in decline. We have a mass exodus of people thinking that church is something that they should be part of, thinking that it is relevant and necessary, that it's worth spending your time and your energy and your effort and your money on. We just see that. We see a mass exodus. And the truth is, those 3 corruptors that have always plagued the church plague us today, right? We see greed, immorality, and status seeking today. When we talk about greed, let's be real. There are leaders in the church who have used that position to become wealthy. There are leaders of the church who have excused being culturally relevant to be greedy, right? And there are leaders in the church that won't talk about the greed in our own hearts and the greed that has taken hold of our culture because it might make people leave, make people uncomfortable. It might, affect their bottom line. And so we aren't dealing with greed. And then when we talk about immorality, we might not be having like people exhumed and judged and all that, but immorality nowadays, we have story after story of pastors who are either part of sexual harassment, who are part of having affairs, or much to our shame is sexual abuse in the church that we have not dealt with. We've not dealt with it well as a church, and not here, but as a big capital C church. Because you know why? We've spent so much time talking about the speck in the culture's eye that we've stopped dealing with the log on our own. And it is time for the church to take a step back and say, you know what? It is not our job to keep judging what everyone else is doing out there if we don't have our house in order. And the church has not had its house in order, and people are leaving because of that, and that is to our shame. And we need to deal with that. We need to stand up and say that's not okay in every single instance that we see sexual immorality in our church such as that. And then status. Here's the deal. As long as the church has power in any way, as long as the church has influence the way that it does, people who love power more than Jesus are going to seek positions of power in the church. If it furthers them, they will. Right? And so some people, whether it's the politician who gives a faint nod to their faith in order to get you to vote for them, left or right, or there's one pastor that I know of who demands that everyone on his staff address him as pastor so-and-so. You will get fired if you don't address him as pastor so-and-so. That's crazy, right? That's just again, I'm expecting people to defer to me because I'm in the position of authority. And so we see status seeking, we see immorality, we see greed plaguing the church. Corruption is still part of the church today, and people are leaving the church because of it. But here's what I want to say about that. Why are we surprised that there's corruption in the church? Again, it has been there from the very beginning. Sin is inside the church and outside the church. It's both of those things. And it is so easy to stand outside of things and throw rocks at it. It is so easy to say, look at all of you not doing, all of you hypocrites, right? But you don't give up everything that has corruption in it. How many of you left Facebook this week, right? How many of you are like, I'm done now that all those internal documents came out about how bad Facebook is, I'm out. No, you didn't leave Facebook. Maybe some of you did, but most of you didn't, right? Most of you are like, yep, Facebook is terrible. It's terrible. I'm still good. You're going to go watch these clips. You might be watching them right now on Facebook, right? You don't eliminate everything in the world because there's corruption. And I want to be clear. It should be different in the church. It should be different in the church. We have the right to hold the church to another standard, right? We do. But we are the church. There's no them out there. If you're sitting in here and you're a follower of Jesus, you're part of the church, right? So you don't get to stand outside and throw rocks and say, all those guys aren't getting it right. If you're not dealing with the log in your own eye, it's really easy to point out the greed, the immorality, the status seeking of other people. Have you dealt with the greed, immorality, and status seeking in your own heart? Because until we start to do that, we do not have the right to start trying to measure other people as hypocrites. Jesus says the way you deal with hypocrisy is you deal with it in you first. If we want a better church, if we want a loving church, there's not someone else who's going to do it. The Calvary aren't coming. It's us. It's us. Just like the monastic movement said, there's no one else to do it. We're going to do it. Someone has to be the light of Christ in the world. It's the same thing for us. If you want a better church, then we have to deal with the log in our own eye. How committed are you to the way of Jesus? What have you put above it? And so when we think about those 3 vows, like I said, I don't think that we need to make a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, right? That's extreme, and that's why monastic movements didn't thrive for the most part. They'd thrive for a season and they'd fizzle out because it was so extreme. You'd have to separate from society. But I think we can adapt those 3 vows for something that makes sense for us today. And I think it would look more like this: simplicity, restraint, and commitment. Simplicity, restraint, and commitment. And so simplicity, monks they took a vow of poverty to free them from the pursuit and love of worldly goods. And I believe that simplicity could do the same thing for us. Now, simplicity is not about being cheap or being stingy or being frugal or not sharing or always buying the cheapest thing. Simplicity is about knowing when is enough. Because we live in a world that promotes insatiable hunger and insatiable consumption. It says, nothing's enough. Your phone is 1 year old? Well, there's now a new phone. You should get rid of your 1 year old. It works fine. You can do everything that you want to do with it, but this one's a little bit better. So you should get that, right? Like your car's a little bit old, get a new one. Your clothes are a little bit outdated, get new ones. Like we are promised, if you make one more purchase, you'll be happy. Just one more. Just this one last thing, and it will all satisfy you. And so we're stuck in this cultural consumption, and we are not dealing with the greed in our own lives. And until we do that, we have no right to call out the greed in the lives of others. And so simplicity is about, sometimes it is buying the less expensive version. Sometimes it's buying the right version, whether it's the least expensive or not, where you're not going to be like looking to upgrade the other thing, right? Like you just buy the one that you want that's going to last, and that's about simplicity, because simplicity, the point of it is about generosity. It frees us up to be generous, where we start to put boundaries around what we will consume, to say, I'm not going to pursue the love of worldly goods. It's a losing battle. It's a losing battle. And we have a series coming up in November called If Only, and we're going to be dealing with contentment, talking about contentment in our life. So if that's an area where you are feeling a little nudge of commitment, be there for that series. We're going to go deeper into what does it look like to commit our lives to pursuing Jesus. And it doesn't mean that we leave the world, but we put the world in its right place. And then restraint. Again, the monks took a vow of celibacy to say that the sexual immorality that they see in the church is just running rampant and something needs to be done. And they relied on restriction. If we restrict it, then we'll be free of it. And I don't think that that's right for everyone. For some people, that is right. Some people have chosen that way. But for most of us, it's about restraint, which is less about restriction and more about boundaries again. In a world right now where, our sexual ethic has gone a little bit nuts. We look a lot closer to Rome than we used to. Choosing to say there is a right and a wrong. Choosing to say that this is not what's good for people. You're choosing to say that I'm not going to pursue multiple sexual partners. I'm going to pursue monogamous relationship, a monogamous committed relationship. I'm going to pursue sexuality within the way that the type of relationship that God wants me to have, which is committed to one other person, to stay with that one other person and to work it out through thick and thin as long as we are able to. To say what we are not willing to do is often more powerful than giving ourselves over to whatever it is we can. And so restriction, again, is about boundaries. And that's around our sexual restriction, to say not just, how many partners I'm going to have or not. It's this idea of, well, what are you consuming? What is our relationship, and our attitude towards pornography? What types of media are you consuming? Are you consuming, romance novels that are then, that's very much a female version of pornography, where we start to idealize someone else and then we become dissatisfied with our spouse, right? What are you allowing in your mind to have restraint around that? Food and drink as well. How much do we eat? How much do we drink? Often we measure that all by addiction. Addiction is our standard to say, I can't stop. Well, sometimes that's not the standard. It's, it's not that you can't give it up, it's that you won't give it up. And when we won't give something up, then we begin to see idolatry, right? That I'm relying on something outside of God for my own well-being. I'm assuming that this will make me happy or this will make me satisfied. And so choosing the way of restraint, not restriction, but to put boundaries and say, actually, I don't get to do whatever I want. I'm going to choose to live in the ways of God. And then the last one is commitment. And the monks believed that to withdraw from the world would allow them to be devoted to the way of Jesus. But someone had to do it. Someone had to not only just preach the right thing, but live it too. And for us, I think obedience looks a little bit more like commitment, meaning we don't just come on a Sunday morning and think like, okay, I did that. Good for me. Here's news for you. God is not taking attendance on Sunday morning. Like, he's not. I'm not taking attendance. God's not taking attendance. It doesn't matter. But I don't want to hear the church doesn't matter, because it's not about showing up one Sunday, and then going out and doing whatever you want for the rest of the week. The reason why Sunday matters so much, the reason why I would say church matters so much, is because this is what fuels us to live out our faith when we leave these doors, to live out our faith in our workplaces and in our neighborhoods, in the grocery store, when you're online, when you're on the phone with customer service and you've just been put on hold for like the 15th time and you do not want to practice the peace of Christ in that moment. Like Andy Stanley talks about, like, there's some sermons that are like, masterpieces that just define your life. He said, but most sermons are like meals, right? Like you are alive today because you've had a few great meals, but most of the meals, you can't remember most of what you've eaten most of your life, but you have nourished your body, right? And it has enabled you to be here. Sunday morning is nourishment for our soul that enables us to live out our faith. That's why consistency and commitment to being part of a community is so important, and it enables us to live out passionately. Because, like I said, there's no one else coming to fix the church. If you're waiting for someone else, they're not coming. It's you, it's me, it's us. Brennan Manning says this. He says, leadership in the church is not entrusted to successful fundraisers, brilliant biblical scholars, administrative geniuses, or spellbinding preachers, though these assets may be helpful, but to those who have been laid waste by a consuming passion for Christ, passionate men and women for whom privilege and power are trivial compared to knowing and loving Jesus. There has always been corruption in the church, and there always will be. There is no perfect church. There is no corrupt, free, capital C church, right? Because sin is real. But if we want to deal with it, if we want to be different, if we want to live different, if we want to see a loving church, a community that represents Jesus, it starts with us dealing with the log in our own eye, the ways that we fail to live up to the way of Jesus, not the way that others fail. We're not called to stand outside. No correction in the church happened because people stood outside the church and threw rocks at it and criticized, because that's often what we use, criticism and judgment against the church. But the same tools that have always brought about correction are available to us today. Persuasion and example. To live in a way that stands out, that persuades others to live this way. Because the reason why monastic communities worked is because people were craving something different. And today, people are craving something different because the way of Jesus is so compelling. When we live that way, it is like a light in the darkness. And I'm gonna have our ushers now, they're gonna hand out some candles right now. And I want everyone to take one. We're not lighting them today. I want you to take it with you. And like I said earlier, the monks, when they would pray, they would light candles. They would light candles to be a symbol of the light in the darkness, that they were called to be a light even when the church was at its darkest. And my challenge for us is it's very easy to stand outside the church and criticize the church. How many of us are praying for the church? How many of us are saying, I know the church can be better? And it's not just them, it's me. That I can be better. It starts here. And so my challenge for us is I want you to take this candle and I want you to daily light it and take a moment to pray both for your own heart and the way that you follow Jesus and your own commitment to the way of Jesus. The log in your own eye, because we can't deal with it. We can't deal with the speck in anyone else's. We can't see clearly until we deal with our own shortcomings. And I want you to pray that the church would thrive, that we would see revival in the church, that we would see people coming back to the way of Jesus, that we see people who are so in love, who have that passionate commitment, because that's who's called to lead the church, and that's who we are called to be. So let's pray. Gracious God, we're so grateful for who you are. We're grateful that you've always called people to bring us back to ourselves, that you've always reminded us who we are supposed to be in the world, Lord. And God, the American church is in need of correction. Forgive us for the ways that we have stood outside of that thinking it's someone else's job. And Lord, let that correction start with us. Our own commitment to root out greed and immorality and status seeking in our own lives. And that we would be devoted to who you are and live in a way that exemplifies the way of Jesus, that is so persuasive that other people can't help but take note of it. Let it start here, God. And as we light these candles daily, help us to pray earnestly for revival in your church. We would see people turning back, not just nominally, Lord, but turning back with passion to the way of Jesus, that we would live differently in the world. And we pray this in your name.